Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Welcome, everyone. Like David mentioned, this is going to be an engaging conversation. We have a star-studded panel. And the discussion we had prior to this meeting, if that's any indication, 45 minutes are going to go so fast. So keep all your burning questions here in the comments because the panelists would really love to address all your questions and concerns. So let me jump into it and introduce our speakers today. Bednar is the Executive Director of McMaster University's MPP in Digital Society program in Hamilton, Ontario, where she is also an adjunct professor of political science. She is a public policy forum fellow and writes the newsletter Regs to Riches. I love that name. Wes, could you please drop the link to that newsletter for our attendees? Thank you. And we also have with us Dr. Saima Akhtar, who is the Associate Director for the Vagelos Computational Science Center at Barnard College at Columbia University. She's an interdisciplinary researcher with a background in architecture and software engineering. That's quite a combo. At Barnard, Saima is focused on widening computing pedagogy to include social science and humanities, both the topics, and in lowering the barrier of entry into computing for women and non-binary students, and fostering critical thought around the creation and integration of technology in our everyday lives. And last, but certainly not the least, we have Stephen Kels, who is a lecturer in the University Center for Human Values at Princeton, where he teaches ethics as applied to public policy, markets, and technological innovation. His research is on the history of capitalism in a transatlantic context, starting with pre-capitalist farming in England in the 1600s through the corporation in 20th century America. He has helped design ethics curricula for engineers in tech companies and for undergraduates getting their first introduction to the field. And most recently, he has worked with graduate students from disparate academic disciplines in a program meant to demonstrate how their unique research backgrounds can contribute to the growing field of AI ethics. Welcome, everyone. Let me get started with giving you all just a plain platform. In 45 seconds to a minute, I want to talk about the pipeline issue that is so, of great relevance. So responsible tech is the need of the hour. Do you think we have a pipeline problem for students as well as educators to integrate responsible tech in academia? Vas, would you like to go first?
I would, and warning, I have a Fisher person's friend in my mouth as I speak to you. You know, when I think about pipeline issues, I think more about the types of roles that our soon-to-be graduates want to take on in a Canadian context, and how the responsible tech framework is a little bit less sophisticated, maybe, so that they're thinking about not only roles that exist inside and outside of government, but also roles that should exist, right? And how do you kind of co-create ways to embed that policy lens into a smaller stage or earlier stage companies so that innovators can be more responsible, but also policymakers can be more forward-looking. It's kind of where my head's at on that.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Saima?
Yeah, I mean, I think starting from personally, I feel pedagogy could help with some of the pipeline problems. I think that especially in the responsible tech space, there's a need to think a little bit more broadly outside of just computer science as a discipline. And so I'm really actually excited about the interest that's been generated in the last 18 months with the pandemic. I think people have moved more online. We're starting to gather in these virtual spaces. We're starting to pay more attention to the virtual space as a space where inequities can be exacerbated. And so I think it's made it a little bit more plain and clear that these are issues that are real and impact people who are marginalized, disadvantaged, communities of color. And so I'm really, really excited to be part of this conversation about the work that All Tech is Human is doing in the space that you're providing for educators and people in educational institutions to come together and have conversations like this. And I'm sure we'll dig in a little bit more, but those are just my initial thoughts.
Sounds wonderful. Steve, how about yourself?
So one of the reasons I'm so happy to have met my co-panelists over the course of the past couple of weeks is that we all have pretty deep experience in different parts of that pipeline question. And what I've been working on most recently is working with graduate students, mostly PhD students, who have very specialized training within their discipline, and may, because of that specialized training, come away thinking that they can do nothing but their discipline. And in our interdisciplinary cohort on ethics of AI, we've been bringing in outside speakers from companies and from government, and of course from nonprofit firms as well. And we've been having them speak about ways in which the field actually calls for anthropologists, scholars of English literature who are comfortable with textual analysis. It calls for people in computer science. It calls for public policy experts, and it calls for basically all of us to be talking about where tech is going, to be talking about what AI is doing. And I think that's particularly true of AI applications that are going to come in the next 20 years. It's going to touch all aspects of our lives. And so we need experts on all aspects of human life and society to be sort of putting their input into how to regulate, govern, and control these technologies.
Yeah, excellent point here. And I love the fact, what was mentioned, and this is something that I've been doing through the course of my career as well, like creating and co-creating things that do not exist, because these technologies are new. There is no a set format. We don't know what we are dealing with till, something happens and there is an unprecedented pandemic in the mix, like, Saima just mentioned, and we had to adapt to it, and we had to revisit the whole educational system. And like Stephen so nicely mentioned, and it's very interesting because Stephen, you mentioned about the PhD and grad students, but you also oversee the undergrads, right? So it's a whole array of young professionals and their needs are different. So I was just wondering, based on these opening statements, if you see there to be some moral or pedagogical concerns about what we are currently teaching.
So I think that as an ethicist by trade, I'll say, using maybe an ironic phrase, as if there is such a trade. As an ethicist by trade, a lot of ethics courses for undergraduates focus quite a bit on textual analysis. And that's an important skill, and students can actually use that well outside of thinking about ethics. But it's really important, I believe, that as you're starting with undergrads and moving them through an ethics curriculum, that you also give them experience encountering ethical dilemmas as they might encounter them in the workplace. We all, the older we get, the more experience we have encountering ethical dilemmas and oftentimes failing at them, let's be honest. But then being able to reflect on them, and et cetera. And I don't think we always realize that we know when an ethical dilemma has arisen in our lives and can pause in that moment and reflect. So I've tried to build into some of my undergraduate courses. In one course, I called it Workflow Wednesday. On Wednesdays, we actually talked about an engineer's workflow and a model technology, a use case that was being developed. And we said, well, hey, where in the development process would you intervene to raise this concern that you've all seen? Like I said, trying to give them practice on recognizing and responding to ethical dilemmas in the moments that they're happening.
Yeah, that is such a brilliant way of doing things, because use cases, I think, are the way to go, especially when we're talking about responsible tech. And I like the the play on the W, the Workflow Wednesday. Nice going there. Saima, would you like to comment?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think that we're producing some kind of model here. I think we're in a really unique place, which is a center for computational science in a liberal arts context and a historically women's liberal arts college. And so what better place to really integrate like Chhavi mentioned at the beginning, social science and humanities thinking into computer science. It's not really a natural fit, but I think that with all of the literature that we've been seeing lately with people like Safiya Noble, and Ruha Benjamin and Timnit Gebru, and a lot of the material that's been coming out that is provoking more public discourse around what does it mean to even encounter an ethical dilemma in the tech space, and then what might possible solutions to that look like. I think one of the big issues is also who is being attracted to these fields, who is working in the various subfields of tech, and who do they look like, what are their life experiences like. And so getting more diverse voices and a range of voices, and also diversifying the kinds of thinking that go into computer science curriculum. So part of what we're trying to do here at the center is really build out programs with that as a foundation. And so we have a computing fellows program where we train undergraduates who are generally sophomores and juniors to be paired or attached to courses that may not have had a computational component to it, but really thinking and working with peers to be able to develop thinking around, okay, if we wanted to integrate some kind of framework here, that's computational, what might that look like? So that works to empower students themselves and also act as peer mentors. We have a BEARS program which attaches undergraduates with PhD students in computer science at Columbia, so really taking advantage of that relationship, as they say, across the street. We have workshops every other Friday that are really meant to be introductory workshops, so people have a safe kind of open and collegial space to ask questions and make mistakes and figure out how to troubleshoot and debug. We also have a diversity in computing series that started this year and is going to continue into next semester, that invites one STEM leader a month to talk about the work they're doing in either academia or industry, to diversify the field from the inside, or even just talk about some of the more structural issues that need to be attended to make the space a more equitable space. And so these are the ways that, we're trying to get a lot of different ways of thinking and have students exposed to different people in different fields and show them models to inspire them about what it might look like once they have a degree in hand and where they can go.
Well, this sounds like a huge undertaking, and it's so fascinating. I think we will have to have a standalone panel again for the benefit of students as well as educators with you, Saima, at a different point. But I do want to give Vaz an opportunity to comment on this, and we already have questions coming from the audience. So I'll start taking the audience questions next. So Vaz.
Okay, rock on. Hey, I'm taking notes from both of you too. These are great ideas. As I said, our program's in its early stage, right? So back to the kind of concerns around what we should be teaching. I mean, the program exists to recognize that there's no shortage of opportunities in Canada to study public policy, but that these opportunities are remarkably homogenous and fairly traditional. So in skating on that ice rink of what do we teach and how, a really important thing to think about is, what are we teaching about the messiness of public policy and the influence of corporate interests and their tactics? And frankly, it seems, historically new that policymakers really care so deeply about the opportunity of any, or the prospect of any regulatory intervention to impede this thing we call innovation, right? We see this in Canada with our stalled privacy and consumer legislation bill. Why is that? Canada's like a third, fourth, fifth mover. It's time to modernize our privacy legislation. But why can't we get there? Because Canada's trying to recognize commercial interests in a privacy bill. And we're really trying to have a bigger conversation about when and how companies can use data I'm rambling a little bit, but that's kind of a core, right? How in a classroom setting, do we take that on? And one way we try to is by pairing our anchor academics with policy practitioners. We call them professors of practice. It's kind of a title that's, I don't want to say made up, but it's a little made up, to be honest. And that lets us bring in kind of frontline voices to also talk about what it means to review pre-budget submissions, right? How, when, and if we should even be taking in um, those business interests when we're designing an intervention, and frankly studying regulatory lag, which has always been a function of the relationship between the state and innovators, but we can't really afford it anymore, right? In that gray space, we start to legitimize new potentially new business behaviors that are otherwise not in the public interest. The second quick thing I'll just say is something we think a lot about is, how to present analyzing a policy problem or opportunity, and how to move away from that language set of problem, right? Big P problem. Policymakers don't exist to intervene only when something's a problem. And the reliance we have on the public to prioritize for politicians what issues are, I personally think is starting to become a little bit overblown, right? We have this is not official, but almost like a Spice Girl model of policymaking. Tell me what you want, what you really, really want. And in the tech and innovation space, sometimes we just need policymakers to do the right thing as quickly as they can and not wait for 80% of the population to be showing in a poll that they want new privacy and consumer protection legislation, just to bring it back. So thanks for the question.
No, this is such a fascinating conversation, and you said the right words. Regulatory lag, and that's something that we all have been dealing with, and I think that would be another standalone session as well. And I'm getting a lot of response from our audience on the professors of practice, and that may be a made-up position, but hopefully it'll do something. It seems like they have professors of practice at Northeastern University. Bobby just shared. And then people are commenting, are all titles made up? Well, some of them are, mine may not be. And somebody's saying that Professor of Practice sounds like a great program, and perhaps we can revisit that in a different session. Okay, and you posted some updates. So I want to address some of the questions that are coming from our audience. This one is for you, Stephen, from Deb. She says, thanks so much. I'm one of those textual scholars that you mentioned, and I would love to think more about how to integrate practices like yours into a course largely anchored in an investigation of literary texts. Ooh.
So I'll give you 3 examples of sort of, in response to what I think was your earlier question, Deb, 3 examples of just sort of use cases that we've used. Most recently, when a book by Cesar Hidalgo came out called How Humans Think About Machines. Oh, damn, I wish I remembered the title because it's really good. I've used case studies from that. It's questions that he actually asked to a panel of folks about how they would judge humans versus machines. Oh, How Humans Judge Machines, I think was the title of the book, about how humans judge machines. So I used some of those case studies. Also had another instance where I used a case study that had actually come out of a training regimen for engineers at Google about self-driving cars. The car was both self-driving, but it had other elements to it, like face and body recognition. It recognized the telemetry of a body, and etc. And we used a case study about an app that used face recognition to give people access to a public service. And very schematized, maybe a paragraph, shorter than the introduction that Chhavi gave to any of us, explanation of what the app is and what it's doing, so that they can actually ask questions about, well, what if it were doing this? If it were doing that, but using a different technology, how would we judge it? And then the connection is to try to bring them to use the principles that they've learned from a text to bear in a conversation among engineers, where a reference to Immanuel Kant may not carry a heck of a lot of weight. So part of what an ethicist is, I think it should, but it may not. So part of what an ethicist is doing, oftentimes in an undergrad course, is internal consistency of a text like that by Immanuel Kant or Peter Singer or whatever it might be. But we want to get them to be able to sort of abstract principles out of there, to be able to state those principles as, multi-step arguments, a few steps of argumentation, and then apply it to the cases. I hope that's enough to be suggestive, at least. But Deb, we should talk later also.
Yeah, I think she's really interested in hearing more about how the workflow goes. And thank you for answering that, Stephen, because I think I went on to another comment that came from Deb in the comments. I guess this question from Plus Aziz is for all of our panelists, and that's a good question. What types of responsibilities fall on the data scientist versus those assessing their models? Is a third party the most optimal way to ensure ethics are upheld? Or can a single person integrate those concerns as they are built as they build their model? Like, I have much to say about this, but how about you guys go ahead? Saima.
We had a speaker a few weeks ago called Jiahao Chen, who works at Parity AI, which is a very new startup that bills itself as an anti-racist AI startup. And part of what they do is actually just that. I think they act as third party, like they are hired by different kinds of companies and corporations to assess models for certain kinds of biases. And so that might be in the financial sector around the way that mortgage lending happens or how credit scores are checked, and it may happen in other fields like healthcare. I personally think that not everybody is trained to assess a model for a certain kind of bias. So that responsibility shouldn't be on one person. I think there needs to be, again, this is a pipeline problem because there need to be enough people educated in different kinds of disciplines so that we can have a multidisciplinary analysis of a certain problem and think about what that looks like in the real world. And so part of what Jiahao Chen was talking about was, what does this look like when it comes to credit reports or credit scores and banks and financial institutions? And so this idea about a professor in practice, and I have seen that, it's an interesting one because it is difficult to apply theory to a real world problem. And sometimes we often don't get the chance to do that because we're not really exposed to what that real world problem might look like. And so I think it's really important for people who are either doing the work or offering certain kinds of internships. And I'm sure that the All Tech is Human job board may be a good resource for this, is for students to get a sense of, what does this look like in the real world? Like, how can I apply my knowledge of English or my interest in law? Like, where may those opportunities be? And I think it's really important for students not to get discouraged if they're either pairing their CS degree with another discipline. I think it's actually an asset rather than a weakness.
Yeah, and this is right in Stephen's wheelhouse, and then I want to move on to Wes with the regulatory perspective. So please go ahead and add your perspectives.
I'll do my best very quickly. And Stephen, I love your keyboard moves when you're reaching forward to type. It's all good. We support you. I love the chat, that we have the chat function too. Let's just call it. A few very quick thoughts. I mean, again, for us, it's about the design of the program and how we're training a future kind of class of policymakers. And one of the things we do in that regard is we have them in skills labs. They're not quite micro credentials, but while they're in graduate seminars, they're also working with data 1, 2, and 3, working with code 1, 2, and 3, project management, product management, and stakeholder engagement. So they are we're not training the policy students as they're not going to become a senior data scientist, probably not, depending on their undergraduate degree, maybe, but they'll be able to sit in rooms, decision rooms with those individuals. They'll be able to ask good questions about methodology and research design. And I think that's a good step forward if you're not starting from the computational science framework, but you are building a vocabulary, a capacity, and a confidence, even for people that might otherwise kind of be like, I'm not a numbers person. I think one of the things that's broken about policy education more broadly is that, we've siloed, people studying business and then people studying the law, and then, policy people end up being somewhere in between when they should also kind of fit across so many more disciplines than we typically have them.
That's very well said, Vaz. And I think in my own personal experience, I feel like the lingo is so different. So it could be intimidating and you may not be able to address the issues at the same level. So it's a great opportunity to be sitting together with them and imbibing some of those qualities and starting to feel confident and ask good questions, like you mentioned. Steve?
Hi, what did you want me to address, Chhavi? Sorry.
So now just adding on to, the fact that, should there be just one person, which in all our opinion, we need the multi-stakeholders to address any of the AI ethical issues. So in some of the teachings that you're doing from the undergrad level right to the PhD program, what are the measures that you're taking to ensure that anything that's put forward is, the AI that's put forward is sustainable, it's also interoperable, it's transparent?
A very similar set of concerns and actions with what Voss is taking. And again, so we're like to the Workflow Wednesday idea. We tell the students, I have not been an engineer, so I'm telling the students a bit from the outside what methodology looks like. What does the agile methodology look like? What is a sprint for an engineer? What is the Scrum? And very much in line with a game sort of that Microsoft uses to train its engineers. You can assign roles also. You're working in a user interface. You're working in another area, and as you move this technology forward in that sort of Scrum methodology, when would you intervene? What questions might you raise? Might you be biased towards one particular conception of what's right or wrong because your job is to drive forward user experience or something along those lines, or to interact with the customer to make sure that their technical specifications are met, and so on and so forth. So by creating that sort of sense of what's going on in the room, to use Voss's words, that sense of what's going on in the room, sharpen their ability to make ethical judgments there, and then you can actually get at a much higher level with the PhD students, right? We had art and architecture and archaeology are all housed in the same place where I'm teaching now, Saima, which you might consider pretty weird. But we had students from that department who are studying early photography, for instance, from the 1890s. And it turns out the questions of privacy that are raised by early scholars of photography, Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court justice who wrote about photography in a famous article called The Right to Privacy, are very much the same as questions that are being raised now. And it turns out that by studying photography in that era and thinking about what privacy sounded like in that era, these students had much more insight into the technology of having one of these things in your pocket than they even knew ahead of time. They thought they were talking about the 1890s and privacy, but really they were talking about the phone in your pocket.
Wow, this is so fascinating. And I just want to keep listening to each one of you so I can see how good educators and teachers you all are. Well, thank you so much. We did get a comment from Alfredo, who this is directed towards you, Vaz. Thanks for your brilliant presentation. I wonder if a national regulations will be enough, or will we need global regulations?
I mean, I think that's a major conversation we're having about a lot of our digital interventions, because the problems or challenges or business behaviors that regulators are seeking to moderate don't really fit well into geographic boundaries. So maybe the best example of coordination and cohesion is going to be with the digital sales tax. In terms of privacy moving forward, will we see a global standard emerge? Maybe over time, but I don't think that's the way we should start. I think, it's still really important. And of course, it's maybe a Canadian saying this, but it's important to have that federated approach. It's important to learn from the implementation challenges of other jurisdictions, as whatever that gold or global standard could be emerges. Do I foresee more harmonization on interventions like that? I mean, probably, but now we're in a very messy, interesting time, right? Historically, it could end up just being a moment, a blip, where policy professionals, decision makers are finally hot on the case of regulatory entrepreneurship, and the real moonshot is eliminating regulatory lag, right? Having policy people that are anticipatory, spot harms on the horizon, and don't take 10 or 12 or 15 years to introduce a meaningful intervention that, better protects citizens from the harms of be it a giant social media company or a small scale startup that's causing trouble, right? Guardrails are important. Sorry that I rambled so much. I don't know if
No,
that's
you
helpful,
did
Alfredo.
not.
I love your name,
No.
though.
Yeah, I guess the guardrails and ethical frameworks are so needed. And again, it goes back to having that regulatory lag, and also the fact that not many things are happening at the global level, the collaboration that is needed, putting these policies into place. I just got another question from Isa. In addition to teaching policy theory, practice, and technical skills, do you see a role for behavior science in responsible tech education? Liberal universities around the world, especially in America, are struggling to find ways to deal with diversity on campus, balancing the need for emotional safety and the need for robust debate and critical thinking facing cancel culture or deplatforming.
So I have a thought on this. I think that the interest that we've been seeing in responsible tech has, in my mind, really exploded recently. And I think that it correlates with, at least in the United States, a more public awareness of inequities in our society. And so, in my mind, what I really struggle with is and coming from the perspective of somebody who has studied architecture, if inequities that are built into our built environment and just the way that we live and move around every day, if they remain with us, if we haven't really addressed them and the history behind how these inequities have risen, how are we going to address the kinds of inequities that then are replicated in the virtual space? And so, in my mind, this requires kind of a really deep understanding of some of the social problems that we deal with on a daily basis. Like, where do those come from? And again, we have another comment by Matthew Rossi that's getting at this, is that sometimes engineers will grab data from anywhere without a deep dive to understand its origin, collection methodology, consent, et cetera. And again, this might be really unusual to build into quote unquote hardcore STEM disciplines. Is how do you have a more holistic view of some of the work that you're doing, even though larger contextual questions aren't necessarily built into that discipline? I think we need to start to really reimagine and rethink how hard sciences address questions that impact the way we live our lives. And more we're seeing that they do. And it's coming into view more clearly for all of us, I think.
Did either one of you, Ves and Stephen, want to add anything more to that?
I think one of the things I've done that might partially address the question, one of the things I've done is incorporate moral psychology into these more tech-focused and policy-focused ethics courses, so that students can actually get some sort of sense of how the behavioral sciences are looking at the process of moral decision-making, and whether they can start to contemplate how it is that they might want to clean up or counteract some of the biases in moral decision-making that have been uncovered by Tversky and Kahneman and others, and some of the biases in rationality. So to think about moral decision-making is just as important. How do humans go about their decision-making is just as important as thinking about what ultimately would be ethical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to take one more question before it's too late. What are some of the long-term measures that should be instituted now, so that we are grooming the next generation of professionals to develop and deploy sustainable and scalable tech? Can you share maybe perhaps your perspectives based on design thinking or the regulatory aspects, public policy, and AI ethics? I'm going to call upon Ves.
Oh, man. Okay, just kidding. Look, something that ends up being top of mind there is related to, I think, a key challenge in the space that I alluded to earlier, which is, navigating, negotiating private interests, appreciating them in a policy context. So when it comes to what are some of the long-term measures, I mean, I'd like to see more collaboration and overlap, and I guess that Venn between business leaders, innovators, even spaces on campus like incubators that are so popular now, right? Policy, again, I'm sorry that I'm so public policy, rah, rah, rah. That is my lens. Policy leaders, professionals, students should be thinking about what are innovators building or piloting on campus, and where does that fit into regulatory realities? We have often big tech can be a red herring, and we ignore, other ways we can practice radical incrementalism and be good policymakers to allow really cool companies to scale and grow, again, in responsible ways. And I think that comes back to reducing or eliminating a regulatory lag and drag. So I don't even think I super directly answered your question, but I feel good about it because you called on me first.
Let me make Stephen feel a little bit better too.
Okay.
So one of the most interesting, a question that I have moving forward over the course of the next couple of years comes from something that I've learned from my students. And they've increasingly said to me that they focus less on the syntax of learning code. And I'm not a coder, but they have said to me that ever since GitHub started posting little bits of code, they focus less on actually learning how to write the code and more on actually the design of the overall product itself. And I see that as an opportunity for the ethicists and the policy people, Vas. I maybe want you more in charge of it than me, but it's for the ethicists and the policy people to enter into those classrooms in some of the ways that Saima is doing it, some of the ways that you're doing it, to enter into those classrooms, to sort of co-teach and to say, this is more than just learning. You already know this is more than just learning the code. This is designing an influence on human society. Let's think about it from that lens as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to take one last question that came from Love, and it's an interesting question, and I don't know how to summarize it, but what would you particularly want from a tech that is responsible? I know we talk about all the time what we do not want a responsible, we do not want tech to be.
I want companies to talk to policymakers, and I'm sorry that I jumped in now. I'm like busting through. I want that. I don't see private actors dialoguing with government, again, as something that's inherently bad or shady or nefarious. Maybe regulatory sandboxes end up being more of a neutral play space. Maybe universities are actually the right site for those kind of processes to happen. But that's something that I would like to see more of in the future, and not just when it's something that people want or need, right? Not that trick or treat model of change this regulation or else, but really understanding what people want to build and what they want to do, and what the role of the state is there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to jump in. I don't know if I'm going to answer the question directly, but I think it also it goes to what Stephen was talking about earlier. I think there's a slipperiness around these ideas of ethics and morality and a definition of like what is responsible. So what is good for whom and who is in charge of making these decisions. And so I think we need to think broadly about who is in the room, who is doing the coding, who is looking over the models, what are their life experiences. And it's a question about class too. And so I think we all speak from fairly privileged places right now. And so I think that for me, I would love digital literacy and critical thinking to be built into even education before people arrive at a university or college, because that's not everybody's life path, right? And so if we do have a better understanding, again, of some of our the inequities in our history and the way that we are kind of moving about our daily lives and how tech plays a role in that early on in our lives, then I think that it will make for better candidates for whoever wants to kind of enter into the responsible tech space, really thinking about a diversity of voices in all matters of the word. And so not just racial and gender diversity, but also like really thinking about who has access to this kind of information and this kind of education and who is participating and making it and creating it and thinking about it.
Yeah, I love that multidisciplinary, diverse approach. That's fantastic. We are almost at time here, so I want to give each one of the panelists a chance to say something that our attendees can go back to their, take back to their lives in making responsible or thinking about responsible tech in academia. How about you, Stephen? Let's start with you this time.
That sounds like a tall order, Chhavi. I would say this, and it's actually in response to the last question, and I think it would be my take-home message in any of these discussions. For a technology to be responsible, it should serve human needs and not just human wants.
Wow, very well said. Profound, huh? Saima?
I constantly, so I agree with Stephen, and I think that in addition to that, I think that we need to find a balance between a more democratic way of coming to an understanding of what is responsible, what is ethical, and really also how do we support organizations and corporations that have a vested interest in making money, but also can deploy technologies that are useful to society. And that to me is a constant. That's a conflict, and that's always something that I'm thinking about, and there's no easy answer for it. But I think as long as we have that in mind and continue to have conversations like these about it, we might end up in a slightly better place.
After retweeting both my fellow panelists, I would say very briefly, perhaps a key takeaway: policymakers and designers, innovators often have more in common than we think, right? They're both people that are trying to solve problems, but I think of Stephen's points around human wants versus human needs. I think a risk going forward that people could keep their eyes out for, at least we're seeing this in Ontario, where the state is kind of devolving design of tech interventions that are for government that probably should come from government to grassroots organizations that do this work for free to solve for gaps. What we need to do is instead learn from people that might be building something outside of government, but is, fundamentally in the public interest and truly the role of government and not outsiders. So unfortunately, that's not tweetable, but it is something that I'm thinking about and wondering quite a bit.
It's definitely something to think more about. Well, it's imminent that there is a need for us to train and groom the next generation of, multidisciplinary professionals to lead the responsible tech movement going forward. Thank you all for sharing all your insights, discussing some of the challenges, talking about your workflows. And this conversation is just the beginning of the responsible tech movement in academia. And I look forward to connecting with each one of you outside this event and to continue this discussion further. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the summit.